Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. Today I'm going to be doing my July reading wrap up. I have 3 books to talk to you all about, and normally I would be like lamenting the fact that I only quote unquote have 3 books to talk about in my wrap up for the month. But honestly, I'm really happy about the way my July was. Like, I feel like I had a really good July personally, emotionally, mentally, all of those sorts of things. So like I don't even care that I quote unquote only read 3 books. And I was partially thinking like, oh, maybe I'll wait and do like a July August wrap up. But honestly, like I like sort of coming on here. I don't want this to sound like weird or rude or anything like that, but I feel like there's so many times on booktube where people come on here to do wrap ups and they're like, oh, I only read 4 books in the month. So I don't have a lot to talk about, which like relative to booktube, yeah, like that's kind of true, but also we need to stop doing that as a community and just like talk about the books that we've read without adding some sort of disclaimer of how we've done something wrong. Like we beat ourselves up way too much. And so I'm here to talk about 3 books that I read. Generally, I enjoyed all of them to certain degrees. Obviously I wouldn't have finished them if I didn't enjoy them. One book was really great. That's the last book I read, and so it'll be the last one that I talked about. But yeah, I feel like we need to sort of like normalize not always being super speed readers, and knowing that that's okay. So here I am talking about the fact that I read 3 books in the month, which is honestly great. So yeah, anyways, enough of that rambling, and I'm gonna get off my soapbox now and talk about the books that I read. So the first book I have is The Inheritance Games, and this is by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This is the first book in a series, and it's a young adult book. This book gets compared a lot to Knives Out, and once I give the synopsis, you'll see why. You are following this character named Avery, who is orphaned, possibly. Like she doesn't know anything really about her dad, and her mom has passed away, and so she's been living with her sister, who is also in like an abusive relationship and things like that. And so she lives in Texas, and then one day she's really smart and all this stuff, and one day she gets called into the principal's office, and it's because like someone has recently passed away, like this billionaire has passed away and basically left Avery his entire fortune. She doesn't know that immediately. She basically gets told that she's being flown out to the reading of the will for this billionaire because she's been left something. And so she's at the reading of the will with like his kids and grandchildren and things like that. And it turns out that like Avery gets basically everything. But the rule is that she has to live inside of this man's mansion for I think a year. There's like basically this giant mystery that's at the center of it because Avery has no idea who this man is. They've never met before that she's aware of. She doesn't understand like why she's been given this money at all. And obviously like some of the kids or grandkids think that like maybe she's a grifter or she's somehow like stolen this money or gotten in some way. Some people think it's a giant mistake. Some people think there might be a purpose behind it, all this sort of stuff. And so it's kind of a mystery trying to figure out how this guy even knew who Avery was and why Avery's the one who ended up inheriting all this money. But also the billionaire was basically a big fan of like puzzles and riddles and all of that sort of stuff. And so he was constantly doing puzzles and riddles with his grandsons. They find out that there's sort of this like puzzle or riddle that the grandfather seems to have left behind, and so they decide to like try to solve that as like one final thing because they think that'll have the answer for what's really going on here. So yeah, with that synopsis, I think anyone who's seen Knives Out can kind of guess like why this gets a Knives Out comparison. But that like basic like overview synopsis is basically the closest it gets to being like Knives Out, like tonally and even generally plot wise, things like that. Like it doesn't follow the same scheme. I personally was hoping that this book was going to be more like puzzle driven, which is possibly like the nerdiest thing I could say because there are like a couple of like word puzzles and like wordplay things that happen in the beginning of the book, but it doesn't continue throughout, which was very disappointing for me. This is also the first book in a series, and so this is one of those things where like this book feels stretched out quite a bit, and it feels like a story that possibly could have been told in a shorter amount of time. Like I haven't picked up the second book in the series yet. I believe it's just a duology. Don't quote me on that though. I know that for sure that there's a second book out. And so I've been like debating about whether or not I want to pick up the second book. There's a weird like love triangle thing that happens in this story that I don't like either. So like in the end, like I liked sort of the mystery aspect of it and the puzzle aspect of it, but I didn't like all of the like interpersonal relationship stuff that was happening in it, which is also a very big part of the book. So I had like very mixed feelings while I was reading this book, where like part of it really intrigued me and part of it really didn't. And I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to pick up the second book of the series, because I don't know if I care enough to read through that entire thing. So yeah, it was kind of a mixed bag for me. I think I rated this one like 3-ish stars. Like, it's not a terrible book by any means, and it's definitely like a fun mystery book, especially for a young adult mystery, but I feel like the relationship stuff really just like put a hindrance on it. And I was hoping for more puzzles. And yeah, I think I just had different expectations for this book than what it turned out to be, which is just always a little bit sad. All right, next up, I read The Theft of Sunlight by, is it Intisar Khanani? Sorry about that. This is the second book in the series, the Dauntless Path series. The first book was Thorn, which I read last year, and I loved it so much. It was one of my favorite books of last year. I will try to link to the video where I talk about it, but it's a very like slow burning young adult fantasy book that basically works as a standalone. And so this is the second book in this series, and it like takes place in the events after the first book basically stands on its own. So like if you want like a good standalone fantasy book, like that actually works. And then if you want more in the world, then you can pick up the second book. But yeah, in this book you are following a different character, this girl named Ray, who is actually has like a physical disability, like something with her foot. They don't describe it in super detail, but basically there's something with her foot where it makes it so she can't like walk a lot or stand a lot without causing some problems for her physically. And she gets like, her cousin ends up marrying a character from the first book, or is married to someone from the first book. She basically gets invited to visit her cousin at the palace, or in like the main town, and she ends up working as basically a maiden to the queen, who we meet in the first book, or to the princess, I don't remember exactly what the title is. It's hard to talk about this book without talking about the things that happened in the first book, but I will say that I found this book to be slightly more disappointing. It's a bit of a chunker, which I didn't mind going into it, because Thorn is like not quite as thick as this one, but it's like a slow burn fantasy book, and so I figured this was going to be the same. One of the things I liked about Thorn was the fact that, like, even though it's the first in a series, it very much stands on its own. This one does not. This one is basically ends on a cliffhanger, and the rest of the story is going to unfold in the next book, which I think is going to come out next year, which I did not know prior to going into this. I thought it was going to be the same idea as the first book, where you get to exist in this world from a new character's point of view, and it'll take place in the events after the book, but like, I thought it would stand on its own in this world, but it's not. It ends on a cliffhanger, and literally I was really upset about that. And like towards the end of this book, it felt like things were dragging a lot for me plot wise. Like, even as someone who enjoys slow burning fantasy books, like I was reading this being like, I feel like there's a lot of talking, or like a lot of chapters going by, but nothing's actually happening anymore. And then when I saw that there was a cliffhanger, I was just like kind of annoyed, to be honest. I really liked Ray as a character. I think she's really interesting. I think the perspective that she brings, she's someone who like doesn't come from a super wealthy family. Like, her family like sells horses and things like that, and so like in the beginning of the story you see like she's part of like a lower class, and so you get to see like her perspective into the way these upper classes work, and the way like the people around the king and queen all work and stuff is always really fascinating to me, and it's one of the things I really enjoyed about Thorn. But then like there's basically this mystery that is kind of continued on from the first book, that is brought up again in this book, where there are like kids from this kingdom who are disappearing. And so Ray basically is tasked with trying to figure out what exactly is going on, and where these kids are disappearing to, and what's happening to them. And so once Ray takes up that mystery, those things are interesting, and those details are interesting, but it gets really, really dragged out. So for the first half of this book, I was really enjoying my experience with it, and it reminded me so much of what I loved in Thorn. But in my opinion, this book is too long, and it did need to be split up into two books. I mean, maybe it does need to be split up into two books because obviously I haven't read the next book in the series because it's not out yet. And so maybe some really big things happened, but I feel like so far the way the last half of this book went, it doesn't feel like it needed to be two books or it needed to be split up differently. And the fact that it ended on a cliffhanger when I was already feeling very meh about the way the book was going towards the end of the book just made me more upset. So yeah, I mean, I feel like if you've read Thorn, like again, that one very much stands on its own. Maybe wait until the third book is out in the series before picking up the second one, so that way you don't have to sit and wait and deal with the frustration of a cliffhanger. Because personally, I hate cliffhangers, especially when they are in series that I don't realize are series or are like this where the first book is a standalone and then the second book starts to become cliffhangers and whatnot. Like that's not what I signed up for with this series. So yeah, I don't know. Another one where it's like, this is probably closer to a 3.5 star because, again, I like this world. I like the characters. I like the things that they're exploring, but it really did not need to be a cliffhanger at all. All right, and the final book I read this month was Hench by Natalie, Zina, Walschots. So this is basically a superhero fantasy book. But with a twist, obviously. This is probably the best book that I read in the month. Not that there's like a whole lot of competition, as you could tell by this wrap up, but like I really enjoyed my experience of reading this book. So in this story, you are following this character named Anna who basically works for a temp agency as a henchwoman for supervillains. So basically she does a lot of these like really mundane tasks for supervillains, like data entry and working in spreadsheets and stuff like that, because like supervillains also need those sort of like really basic things done. And when the story begins, she ends up getting a new job for this supervillain that she feels like the job has a lot of potential to it. Like she thinks she might end up getting hired like full time for the supervillain. And so he like basically gives her an assignment where everything goes wrong and she ends up becoming like majorly injured. And the quote unquote superhero who in this world who ends up stopping the thing that the villain ends up doing, ends up like basically turning her life upside down. And so after that major event happens, she gets laid off by the supervillain because of course. And so with all of her free time and also because like she's severely injured so she can't do a whole lot, she ends up starting a blog about heroes and talking about basically the amount of like damage and death that heroes have caused that like people generally tend to ignore because they are doing the right thing. And so like obviously like at first like no one's reading her blog and this is kind of her way of just like venting, but she uses her skills as like someone who collects data and does spreadsheets and analyzes all of these different situations, like skills that she's acquired doing her previous job and now applying it towards superheroes. It eventually starts getting some attention and some people start agreeing with her, and then she ends up getting hired by another supervillain, and basically things kind of go from there. Like I feel like I could give you more of the plot to sort of sell you on this book, but obviously I don't want to give you all of the plot details. So yeah, I've been really enjoying the sort of like relatively recent string of books that are coming out that are basically like superhero stories but with a little bit of a twist. So I read the book We Can Be Heroes last month or maybe 2 months ago at this point. I can't exactly remember anymore, which also kind of did a similar thing where they are looking at like heroes and villains with a new perspective. And so this is kind of doing the same thing. And I really liked my experience with this book. I will say again, it feels like a little bit more of a slow burn book. So if you're wanting something with a lot of like plot or action or anything along those lines, something really fast paced, this may not be the book for you. But if you're someone who has consumed a lot of superhero related media, which I feel like if you've even just watched like the Marvel movies at this point, you understand the tropes and ideas, and this has some interesting perspectives on it. Obviously not everything in here is completely original. Like I think one of the Marvel movies, like one of the Avengers movies, is about the amount of like damage that those superheroes cause, but this takes it in a really interesting point of view, and I'm really enjoyed this perspective of someone who's working on the supervillain side of things, being like kind of a completely normal person, but also like you can see sort of like the seeds of evilness in her, and it's interesting to see sort of how her character grows and develops, and also just her dealing with like the PTSD of the really traumatic events that she's gone through. Yeah, it's just like a really fascinating story, and the way that the story developed is really just interesting. It's hard to talk about it without getting into spoilers, but I really like the way that she that the author looks at the ideas of heroes and villains and the things superheroes have to do and the development of them as people and like as heroes and things like that. And there's also like kind of this interesting slight science fiction element to it, which there has to be because like if you're dealing with superheroes who have superpowers, there has to be a slight science fiction element to it. But yeah, it was just like really intriguing, and like I want more people to read this book so I can talk about it in more detail. Like I also think that this would be a really good like book club book, if only because like personally I want to talk about the spoilery aspects of it, like the ideas and the themes and the like bigger topics that she explores using this idea of heroes and villains and the way that we as a society look at heroes and villains in both like sort of this abstract way and like a kind of realistic way as well is really really interesting and really well done. Like I sent one of my friends a really long message talking about this book because I was like, I know you're never going to read this, but I need to talk about this with someone. So I just like talked about it at length with them. That's how much I enjoyed this book. It was a really enjoyable experience and honestly like kind of a really fun summer book that didn't feel like superficial in any way. Like it felt very meaty. And again, it's not super plot focused. Like there are like really action-packed scenes in here because again you're dealing with heroes and villains and there are these big fight scenes and whatnot, but like the chapters are kind of on the longer side in my opinion, and a lot happens in this book and there's a lot of development. It's also a book that like ends in a way that feels satisfactory, but it's also like kind of open-ended, so there could be another book in the future, and if there is, I 100% will be there for it. So yeah, if you're someone who enjoys kind of like the comic book heroes and villains trope and you enjoy people who kind of like play with the trope and look at it from different perspectives, then I think that this is a book that you should add to your list. So yeah, that is everything I have for you all. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of the books that I talked about here, or if you have any questions, you're always welcome to leave that down in the comment section as well. Otherwise, leave a comment down below letting me know what your favorite books were that you read in the month of July. Have you been flying through a million books because summertime, so you have more time potentially? Or are you like me and you kind of slow down with your reading in the summertime because you're busy doing other things? So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.